Welcome back, guys, to the JPS Education Portal. And we have Brian Miner today to discuss navigating slip-ups. Welcome, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
And as always, we have Mac, who is out there in Sydney facing the blistering sun. He's just applied his sunscreen for those of you who were concerned about his skin health. And we're going to talk all things slip-ups and managing those tricky periods where our nutrition or training might not go to plan, and how we can obviously deal with that, and some of the strategies and insights these guys have to improving, obviously managing these situations, but also decreasing the frequency that they happen. So, Brian, let's hand it over to you. What would be some of the main slip-ups that you see with your clients? Because you work with a lot of clients, obviously bodybuilders, but also gym pop. So when the word slip-up comes to mind, what do you think? Like, where does your head go there?
Usually, I guess more often than not, people frame a slip up within the context of a cut, like if they're in a deficit. It's certainly not limited to that, but usually it's people that overate, beyond what their goal was for that day. So, whether it's, the magnitude, sometimes it's not actually a slip up and they perceive it as a slip up where, maybe they're 100 calories over or something, and it's, nothing that's going to make a big difference. And then there's people that have kind of that on off mentality. Either they're on point or things are, a bit more chaotic. They kind of lose that sense of control. So, it's usually related to, consuming more than they had intended or wanted to based on their goals.
Yeah, awesome. That's probably where my head goes when hearing that term. Mac, what about you? What are your thoughts around the idea of a slip-up?
Yeah, so I love this question because I think slip ups are something that everyone encounters when pursuing a nutrition related goal. The goal is usually of a notable magnitude and therefore requires a notable time frame. So a slip up is sort of like a when thing, not an if thing. So how would I define it is it's going to depend on the strategies, the goals, and the expectations, what we would deem a slip up. But really, overall, it's a deviation from goal, and I'm going to add something to that: goal and value directed nutrition. Any deviation from that that is deemed undesirable could be called a slip up.
Awesome, awesome. And I guess an extension from that is, well, what are the main causes of slip-ups? When people are, overeating, when they're in a deficit, or they're moving away from their intended goal and plan, and it doesn't align with their values. What are some of the causes for these things? I think a few obvious ones, change of environment, social pressures, all of these kind of things when there's a situation that's outside of their regular routine. And beyond that, what are some of the other causes that contribute to these slip-ups, Brian? What do you think there?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of dieting, usually, hunger, cravings, obviously, are kind of the two big ones. But, what you said, I think, is also very common. Probably less talked about, though, the changes in environment, the social aspect. There's a lot of people that when they're by themselves and they're in their routine, everything's more or less automatic. And then when they get out of that, around family, that their mom or grandma, prepares a nice meal for them that's, higher calorically, and they're, they feel that obligation or pressure to, consume and not be, not be an outcast in other words. But yeah, I think the environmental aspect and the social element plays a big role as well, like you said.
Yeah, I remember when I was first starting in the fitness industry, and I was, hardcore bodybuilder. I would go to my nonna's house, and all I was eating at this point was, chicken, broccoli, and probably about five foods. And I used to love her food before I started bodybuilding. Like, yeah, anyone who's got a nonna, they know that nonna's food is elite, number one, and you don't say no to nonna. That's
right.
And I used to always turn down her food and bring my own food, and she hated it. She used to, take real offense to that, and I can see why many people wouldn't be able to do that. Like I was obviously very stubborn and very committed to my goals, and in an unhealthy way, might I add. But that's just what I had to do at the time. But that is a huge factor. And Mackenzie, I know you speak about these sorts of things a lot, being able to navigate social situations and indulge in an appropriate manner. So I guess the question I have here is, how do you differentiate between indulging, where it's something that is not necessarily it doesn't have a negative connotation as the word slip up does? How would you differentiate between these two terms? So when somebody's indulging, for example, and that's like, oh, that's okay, I indulge, versus, oh, I've slipped up. Like, where do you draw that line?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. I'm going to say that you transition from an indulgence to a slip up when the level of indulging or just simply indulging doesn't serve a justifiable purpose or bring a worthwhile benefit. So, for example, that could be, let's say you go out to dinner for your friend's birthday and you're at a pizza restaurant. You have a couple of slices and you're ticking off the boxes that relate to why you're at that occasion. You're out there to socialize, spend time with friends, relax, enjoy some nice food. But then, you sort of had a couple of slices, you're feeling satisfied, and then you start to keep going. And then it's like, we'll have some beers with that. And then, we'll get some ice cream after. And it's not actually benefiting the social interactions. It's just adding more calories, which isn't actually necessarily a bad thing. But I guess we could, for the sake of the argument, refer to this as like a fat loss type of slip up when we have some nutrition parameters. So, because I think it's important to remember that, whilst we have nutrition goals, we also have values as humans. And for many folks out there, the social health aspect, time with friends and family, that's an important component of value sets. So we should always, or at least in my opinion, we should consider that when we approach nutrition. And I think it's a good idea to make an allowance for that within a nutrition-related goal for reasons such as longevity, but also to protect that total health perspective. I think it's very easy to get caught up in physical health, which often is sort of a direct I guess, link to fat loss type goals. But we've got to remember that if we want to be a healthy person, we have all these other components of health that our diet should support. And I think because of that, it's justifiable to take a trade-off here and there, because we want to sort of promote not just the physical health side of things. We want to make sure that we're paying attention to the bigger picture.
Yeah, awesome. Brian, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I like what Mackenzie said there. I think it's, anytime it goes beyond what you're there for. And I see this a lot where people will, let's say they go out to eat where they might be able to check the boxes, the social element, go on a date with their spouse, whatever. But when they get there, they have the option to have something that's conducive to their goal, or at least, mitigate the downsides, staying calorically conscious. And since they're out, their mindset might shift from, doing that to like, okay, I'm going to get everything that I'm craving since I'm, out and about and eating at a restaurant. So there's usually options, I think, that are available that are certainly more conducive to others. And for me, it's when because I think, I'm certainly not immune to this. It's when I, like you said, go above and beyond what would accomplish the objective of going there to begin with. Because the goal is never to go there and gorge yourself and be stuffed. But, there's a lot of times people continue eating after they're there because they're hungry, and that's where there can be, some setbacks a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that nobody actually intends to gorge and stuff themselves. And I think this brings up something that's really important to, I guess, identify in this discussion. And it ties back to that indulge versus when it becomes a slip up, is that some of the terminology around binge eating, the objective binge with the amount of calories that you obviously consume. But then there's a subjective component, which is heavily tied to a loss of control. And I think that's where that line is. It's like once you've eaten to a point and then you start to feel like you're losing control for whatever reason, where it's social pressures, whether it's the hunger, whatever it is, there's that loss of control. And I think that's when we know that we've had a slip up, is we feel like we've eaten an amount, generally speaking, that is beyond what we would otherwise eat, and we're starting to consume foods without any purpose or benefit, and it's because we've lost control. So in that situation where people have slipped up because of a loss of control, what are some of the things that they can do in the moment, I guess, to try and gain back some control? Is there any hope in those situations? Like, what are your thoughts around this kind of stuff, Brian?
Yeah, I think being aware of the situation when you go in and just knowing what the purpose is goes a long way. I find a lot of people get into this situation when, good foods are paired with drinks because oftentimes that will lower your inhibition, and, you tend to not care as much about what you're eating. So, but yeah, if you kind of catch yourself, in the middle of a meal going overboard, I usually recommend people stop, kind of remind themselves like, okay, am I craving stuff? Am I bored, or am I actually just hungry? And it is a good feeling when you leave, a social setting like that, or restaurant or whatever, and you know that you've stayed on the tracks towards your goals, but you've also given your time and energy to the other people that are there. But yeah, I think just being aware of it, that you can be susceptible to that heading in if you are somebody that is the first thing. And maybe picking foods next time that you're less likely to want to overconsume.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think awareness is huge. Mac, is there anything that you think that people can do in the moment to, I guess, gain back control?
Yeah, that's a very tricky one. Honestly, I don't, if it's kind of started to slip, I don't think there's a whole lot that you can do. However, taking a pause and saying, if I scratch the front bumper of my car, am I going to write the car off? Or if I get a flat tire, does that mean that the car needs to go into the bin? Just kind of having that pause moment. Is this indulging serving me more? What's the most productive thing that I can do now? Is it worth just going all or nothing? And I think a root of a lot of this is that all or nothing mentality, and that relates back to expectations that we set for ourselves. I think if you want to avoid that scenario, the setup, so what happens prior, I think is so pivotal. And for example, things like, not skipping meals, I'm very cautious of encouraging people to calorie bank. Because when you let yourself get too hungry and you combine that with the anticipation, it's sort of lending itself to the floodgates opening. I think other things like giving yourself unconditional permission, because if we haven't given ourselves permission to indulge, as soon as we indulge, we've already slipped up. And then when you combine that with that all or nothing mentality, like I said, the floodgates open. So in the moment, in summary, in the moment, taking that pause, like, is this serving me? Probably your best bet. But I think that's nowhere near as powerful as getting the setup right.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. So, okay, so on the setup, then what are some things besides potentially avoiding calorie banking, the all or nothing mentality, and not giving yourself permission? What are some other things we can do to obviously prepare ourselves for potentially deleterious situations where slip ups are more likely to happen?
Yeah, I just one for you, Brian. Sorry.
Oh,
Anyone?
it does. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, sorry. I think I covered a few of them. So, making sure that you're managing your hunger levels, doing things like not calorie banking, having a protein and plant preload, I like to call it, sort of in the hours prior, just to take the edge off that hunger. Trying to generally be relaxed, taking that mentality of I'm giving myself permission to indulge because this is going to serve XYZ purposes within my life, and it's going to align with my values, and just really trying to put things into perspective and not coming into that social occasion with the mentality of I'm deviating from anything. And when you have like rigid or nothing approaches to a particular goal, set of strategies, you know, oh, I've signed the contract, bro, sort of thing, can't deviate, then you're kind of setting yourself up for viewing it as a failure. I've failed. And when you failed, you know, that sense of self-efficacy, what's the point continuing to try? You know, you combine all those things and it's like overindulging. So yeah, that's my 2 cents on that one. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah,
Oh, no need to
you should
apologize.
be. You
Yeah,
should be sorry.
I go ahead.
No, I was just telling Mackenzie that he should be sorry for interrupting you. But very, very good points, Mac. Brian, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think, you know, the one thing he mentioned, you know, having some protein before you go can take the edge off of hunger and not entering those situations starving. So, you know, one thing like with intermittent fasting, like there's sort of this fine line if people kind of bank their calories or backload their calories. You know, if there's a large difference in hunger throughout the day. Like I know for me, like I won't get hungry till noon usually, you know, unless I'm deep into a deficit or something. But I get very hungry in the evening. So it's kind of finding that happy medium where I'm, you know, cognizant of that heading in. If I'm going to be like, you don't want to set yourself up for that situation where you're going to be ravenous in those, in that environment. And the other thing is, you know, having at least a general idea. You know, if you know where you're going to eat, um, you know, maybe look at the menu. You know, the nutrition facts online are never accurate, but it's, you know, see what. Like, I think looking at the menu ahead of time can help because you can see, okay, what would be a conducive option here, and you can plan on that rather than being influenced by things that look good in the moment when you get there. Um, by no means required, but I think going in sort of with a plan can help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think having a plan for those situations, and many of them that people aren't going to be able to have a plan, like say, for example, when people go to weddings and things like this, um, you don't know what's going to be served, like you're really blind going in. But I think where possible, having a plan for people who probably slip up or lose control more often than not in these situations is really important. Because like anything, you have to develop this skill, right, over time. And a lot of people can't just go in and go, okay, I'm just going to make an informed choice, just, focus on, eating the foods that I feel like in the moment and stopping when I feel full and listening to my hunger and fullness cues while socializing. Like there's a lot of moving parts there and a lot of different skills that needed to be developed over time. So I think having training wheels on at the start is really important. So for people who are beginners and probably slip up and fuck up most times, when they're eating out or whatever, they need to go in with a plan and have an idea as to what they're going to eat, how much, and having more constraints on things. And then I think the goal should be over time to obviously take those training wheels off and learn to go, okay, now I can go to these things without having to worry about the menu, without having to really focus on, trying to put my cutlery down between bites or, having this protein plant meal before to minimize my hunger and like trying to just take away all of those, I guess, tools that are helping you manage these situations. I think that should be the goal for a lot of people, but they have to realize where they're at. Like, are you someone who is super susceptible to blowing out every time you're in a social situation? Or are you someone who has a little bit of control, but it's just every now and then in certain situations with certain, people or certain foods or cuisines, whatever it is, where you are slipping up. So I think identifying where you're at, are you someone who's learning these skills or are you, somewhat okay in those situations and making sure that the plan is tailored towards your ability levels, I think is huge. But yeah, I totally agree that having some form of plan, is necessary for most people. It's like most people aren't competent where no plan and just listening, to your hunger cues and understanding your values and having perspective. It's like, that's the goal, right? Like that's the end goal. Very few people are there. We wouldn't have an obesity epidemic if most people were there, right? So I think
Yep.
we have to try and get people there. And I know that Max, I can see him like walking around and tapping his fucking legs over there. He's got something to say.
Well, no. I definitely agree. Like it's not a zero to hero thing. I think these are skills and levels of consciousness that take time to build. I think yeah, that idea of checking the menu, having more of like a plan sort of thing is I would describe it also as training wheels, because I think in the long run, it's probably not what you want to be doing. I would generally err towards the side of, rather than having, say, I'm going to have this because I've checked the menu before, rather than doing it that way, having a set of guiding principles instead. So guiding principle could be like, I am going to be conscious of trying to include a lot of plants in whatever I order or whatever is available. I'm going to be conscious of the level of fat within the meats or the cooking methods. And I'm just going to use these general guiding principles, but then I'm going to sort of triangulate them with what's going to be most enjoyable, what's going to serve the purpose of why I'm there, and finding the sweet spot. Because, like, you could go to a social occasion and just get like grilled fish with salad. And that's obviously going to be the most fat loss goal aligned in a lot of cases, but it might come at the expense of enjoying that time and that occasion. So I think you do want to consider what's like most appealing, but then find that sweet spot. Because, yeah, like I said before, I think a lot of issues are derived from all or nothing thinking. And if we start to take more of a spectrum mentality or a dim and knob mentality, I think it's conducive to more longevity and just overall a healthier relationship with food, goals, dieting, etc., etc., etc. And then the other thing is, I think I would also view checking the menu and even like tracking in advance or anything like that as training wheels also, because there are going to be times in life where you're at a wedding, you don't have control, or there's no menu for that, or you decide on the spot where you're going to go, or plans suddenly change, or all these things happen that if you don't have a backup plan, or if you're like, I'm so fixated on eating this because I've checked the menu and this is what I'm having, and all of a sudden like that can't happen, guess what? You've actually just slipped up. You failed. And think about the psychology around that and what could then occur. And I would see that as undesirable. So yeah, agree, training wheels, but end goal, guiding principles, and also being able to do it on the fly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I agree completely there.
Anything you want to add there, Brian? Or
no, I'm glad he mentioned that, because that probably is the best way to describe it is training wheels, because you will be in situations where you're not going to know, and you need to be self-aware in terms of what you might be susceptible to, and use those principles to navigate through it.
yeah, it's like in those situations where you don't know what kind of foods you're going to have, or you're unable to plan as much, and you're aware that, okay, I've got my training wheels on. You know that those situations you don't have your training wheels, and that you're likely to fall over and slip up, and that's okay because you're still practicing. And I think that's a useful way to look at it. But I guess we've covered sort of the I guess, slip up situation, and then obviously we've discussed a little bit, what you can do in the moment. But then what about after the fact? Because I think this is a big one. Because Mackenzie, you always use the analogy, you've slashed one tire, right? You slipped up on one day. Why slash, the other three tires and keep slipping up? But obviously, it's a lot harder in practice and in real time for people to regain control of their nutrition once they've had that slip up, or sometimes they'll regain control, but they try to make extreme adjustments to their diet and compensate for their overeating. I think this is a very common one. And that's one thing that we have to avoid. So here's, I guess, the question: what are the things that we should do post slip up to help us get back on track? Mackenzie, over to you.
Yeah, I absolutely love this topic because I think it's so important. You mentioned something there, like every experience is an opportunity to learn. So I think that's the first thing. It's not necessarily a negative thing to slip up. It's an opportunity to learn, but also understanding that slip ups are a when thing, as I said before. They're not an if thing. They're going to happen. So, our success in our nutrition pursuits is largely a product of how we react and respond to those slip ups, but it's difficult because, you might have built up some momentum. And then all of a sudden, that momentum's gone to the wayside. You might feel a little bit upset about it, guilty, all these sort of things. And pulling yourself out of that rut is quite difficult. So like you said, Jacob, starting off, it's a learning opportunity, but also coming at it with the approach of it's normal. And also, there's always a reason behind a slip up. I think I speculate that a lot of coaches, when clients slip up, oh, try harder next time, you're going to have to do better than that. Not really troubleshooting. Every behavior happens for a reason, as Josh Smith would say. Every behavior happens for a reason. They don't happen by chance. Slip ups do not happen just by magic. So I think if we're going to, react and respond. It's about, okay, what's the most productive thing to do right now? It's to reflect and learn, and see if we can try and, establish why it happened and what we can do to reduce the risk of it happening in the future. And maybe it's a case of it's so infrequent. It's just something that, we can't really, there's no point in change anything. It's so infrequent that we'll just move on. Okay, so now we've troubleshooted, we've reflected. We're moving on now. What's the best way to move on? So if there are take-home lessons from this experience, we can try and apply them. Should we try and compensate, bank calories fast the next day to sort of undo damage? I mean, you could, but I think there's a lot of risk attached to that. And we run, for example, the risk of creating a bit of a binge restrict cycle. And, whilst, eating less the next day or calorie banking and these sort of things can be useful strategies, they're very easily overused and over relied upon, and that can generate a lot of risk. So I'm a proponent of, what's the most productive thing to do right now? Let's just slide back into our routine. Let's not skip breakfast the next day. Let's not, take the carbs out of our lunch. Let's just slide back into our routine and let that normality establish as soon as possible. I think that's the most safe, risk-free approach to take.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I often advise my clients to avoid being reactive with their nutrition, especially if there's someone who is in this beginner stage of their eating it, or there's someone who's more susceptible to, pathological like eating tendencies and, body image stuff, which I think a lot of the demographic that I work with are more susceptible to, being physique athletes. I think being reactive with your nutrition, especially after a slip up, is just like, you're going to start playing, calorie Tetris across a week. And like, that's not a good idea. Like I think one person, or to my knowledge, like only a few people have ever really beaten Tetris, right? I think that's like, no, you can't beat Tetris. Just like, how do you beat your reactive nutrition? It's like, if hunger's involved and you've got, all these other things, that are making your nutrition difficult to gain control of, I think it's just a really bad idea to try and, adjust things post hoc, right? It's like you have to be proactive, if anything, and avoid that. And Brian, what are you looking up there? Are you looking up to see if anyone's beaten Tetris? I hope you are.
Well, I am actually, because
I want to fact check that.
Because just recently,
Yeah,
I got to fact check you here.
I saw on social media, the first kid, yeah? Is that right?
Yeah, I think he 13. Yeah, 13 years old was the first kid to like officially beat Ted. But your point still stands.
Hey, I wanted that to be fact checked, because I also saw it on social media. And I was like, "Ooh, I don't know if this is actually 100% true," but I saw it on social media, so it must be true, right?
Well, I'm basing my fact checking off of the post I saw on social media, so maybe it has. I was surprised by it too, but anyway.
That's not a PubMed link. It's not a systematic review, so yeah, not sure about the reliability of that data you got there, Brian.
No. I'll dig into it.
Dig into it. Okay, so on that point, Brian.
But yeah, I agree with everything both of you said. Being able to just, I think acutely, if you screw up, remind yourself, like, okay, this is of that analogy, slashing one tire. There's objectively, there's no reason why continuing is going to help anything. But yeah, it's almost like selective amnesia. You're just moving past the day, starting over, and getting back into that structure. And I also recommend people, if they do that, if there's somebody who weighs in daily, maybe take a day or two from weighing in, because I know for some people, if they weigh in the next day and they're up from additional glycogen, sodium, whatever, that can be discouraging. And you have to ask yourself, like, is this data informative towards anything anyway? Because it's usually pretty misleading. So I usually recommend people avoid weighing for a couple days after a slip up, just to let things stabilize a little bit and just get back to the plan. But I'm pretty against the caloric banking, leading up to one of those events, or, restricting after, just because I think it can lead to that binge and restrict cycle for some people susceptible to it.
Yeah. I think the binge restrict cycle, people need to be aware when they're sort of doing things that are going to facilitate that. I think that's a huge key to, I guess, unlocking, your ability to move away from slip ups over time is to realize when you're getting into this like stage of, okay, well, I've overeaten, now I'm going to undereat, and noticing those patterns. Like a lot of people don't notice the patterns, but they'll fast in the morning, do extra cardio, and then maybe they're not hungry that day. They stick to the plan, they feel great. But then it's like, okay, 2, 3 days later. And I think this is where having a coach is really useful because most people are, caught up in their lives. Like they're zoomed right in. They're not paying attention to the longer term trends and the patterns of what's going on. Whereas a coach can really be useful in being that objective eye that notices, okay, well, every time that you've eaten out and you reduce your calories the next day, the next 4 days later, you're fine. But then after that, then things start to fall apart again. And I think people just really struggle to see this because they don't actually have that bird's eye view of their schedule and what's happening with their nutrition over longer times. Well, most people don't anyway. Is there anything that you want to add to that, Mac?
Uh, what I would say is probably that a slip up is only a problem when it turns into a write-off. In most cases, what we would deem a slip up is going to have a negative impact on the goal or progression towards it that is akin to like a drop in the ocean. If we let a small slip up turn into that write-off, then yeah, we're going to have a level of impact on the goal that's going to be notable. So I guess that's probably the only thing that I would add to that.
Yeah, yeah. Brian, anything that you want to chime in there?
Nothing else to add there. I echo everything he said.
So if people are slipping up very frequently, and they're unable to sort of get that momentum or back into their routine, Mac, I'd be curious to hear what you think about how people can get their ball rolling with their nutrition. If there's someone who say they're coming to a coach for the first time, they've been, almost spiraling out of control. They've just not been able to really get their nutrition on a roll, so to speak. How do you get people to fall into that routine? Because obviously you mentioned sliding back into your routine, but for a lot of people who have frequent slip ups, like there's no real routine there. It's like it's happening every so often, and it's just there's no real routine that they can slide back into, and their self-efficacy in sliding back into routine may be very low because they're just unable to string together consecutive, on plan, so to speak, days. How do you get people into routine? I guess what are some of the things that you can do to fast track that process?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point there. I mean, someone comes to you, they've tried and tried again, they fall, slip up, give up, throw the towel in, throw in the towel, whatever the saying is. Firstly, well, why? And often it's like, oh, I was too hard, or I couldn't stick to it for more than X weeks. Or, it was all good, but then after a while, it just got a bit hard. I went on holidays and all these sort of things. And I think all of them link back to expectations being beyond what is feasible for a meaningful amount of time. So I think a big part of it is actually adjusting the expectation to something that is almost certainly achievable. And the client has actually expressed that's the case. They're confident about it. And you've also gone into plan Bs and sort of things and what have you. Anyway, that's beside the point. It's almost like pulling things back and starting off with just one or two things and building up over time. Not setting the expectation to at a certain level that they're inevitably going to fall short of, which they have done 20 times already, and they're already feeling like they're a failure because they've tried 20 times, they've tried to lose weight for 10 years, and they've failed every single time. So yeah, honestly, I think a big part of it is just pulling the expectations back. And obviously that means that you're taking steps away from optimal efficiency as progression towards the goal. Like you're taking steps away from optimality. But like a plan or an expectation or whatever is only good as someone's willingness and ability to actually adhere to it. So, okay, yeah, doing this other thing might be more optimal for this fat loss goal, but like they're never going to do it. So why are we even having this discussion? And then sometimes you also might get people who are resistant to taking a pullback approach. They're like, no, I want to be more hardcore. It's like, okay, sure. How's that gone for you in the past? Yeah, I've been trying something like this for 10 years, hasn't gone so well. okay, are you open to maybe a different approach where we build up over time? Even if they might even say no to that, in which case it's like, right, I'll support you in what you want to do. And then maybe we can have a discussion in a month when you inevitably fail and you might be more receptive to what I have to say. But also, I think Dr. Mike mentioned this in the last one, Jacob, and it was a really good point. It's like there are situations where someone might not be ready to change. And I think that is a whole nother kettle of fish, but it's worth mentioning that because it's not like I by all means do not have the answer to every possible client who's tried and tried again and cannot find that routine. I definitely don't have the answer to that.
Yeah, I think at some point you're exactly right, Mac. It's the expectations being lower, because obviously sometimes if people are falling short, they might be just chasing something that they're unable to do, or achieve at this point of time. And I think that's something that a lot of coaches don't really want to admit or advise their clients, is that if they're constantly slipping up, that maybe you just need to put a pause on this. Obviously there are other things that a coach can help you with, specifically a PT who's training someone as well. Like there are other obvious benefits of, getting programming or training from a coach, as well as, maybe putting that pause on nutrition goals. But if you're someone who's trying to lose fat, or you're, trying to get your nutrition in check, and you're really struggling to do that, it's like, well, maybe it's just not the right time to focus on that. Obviously, that's not to say just abandon it and fucking go off the rails and gain 30 kilos. That's obviously not what I'm saying here. But whether it's a fat loss goal, especially, I think if you're trying over and over and it's just not working, you might need to have that conversation if you are a coach or with yourself, and just say, hey, maybe this isn't something that I can actually achieve at this point in time. And that's okay. I've got to focus on other things to maybe set me up for that fat loss goal in future. And I think taking one step back to go two steps forward, if you're somebody who's having very regular slip ups, is absolutely necessary. Like you need to focus on weight maintenance, developing some solid behaviors and consistent routine around your eating, and dealing with all the psychological, I guess, bullshit that you've got going on when it comes to your food, because there is something there. And I think a lot of people don't want to admit that. And coaches are often not willing to have that conversation with their client, because once they take away that goal, their purpose and their profession and livelihood is somewhat diminished, and it compromises obviously their bottom line at the end of the day. So I think that's a really important point, Mac.
That was a really good point there, Jacob, about if they say to the client like, hey, this goal like maybe not so good for you, it's like they feel like maybe what's my purpose as a coach? What value am I providing as a client? And they might be a little bit hesitant to consider that as an option.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, but that's where coaches have a lot of other value in other ways, right? I know, Brian works with people on their nutrition and training. It's like you just double down your training. Okay, we're going to eat a little bit more, put you in a surplus. Hey, we'll try to control the rate of fat gain, for example, but more calories gives you more opportunity to, practice creating that routine and consistent eating behaviors, with more food and less hunger, and, less likelihood of, binging and things like that. And I think that temporal step back away from the goal, in my experience, for a lot of clients, is not only necessary but super beneficial. Like I coached one girl for a long time, and like all she wanted to do, she's an influencer online. Like she has 500,000 followers. Her physique is heavily tied to her career and her identity, and she was always wanting to do diets, and she got really lean and had rebounded a little bit and gained quite a bit of weight. And when she came to me, she wanted to go back into a diet, and I said, that's not what you need. I said, I'm not going to put you in a deficit. Like, if you want to get coached by me, I'm sorry, but that's not what I'm going to do. We're going to focus on your training. We're going to, put you in maintenance, get these eating issues under control, and then we'll revisit a deficit, when that happens. And I worked with her for no shit. I think it was about 12 months or more without putting her in deficit. And she would come to me every like 4 weeks. Like, can we diet now? I was like, no, you just can't. Like, and that was a rare case where I actually had someone who was fed up with this yo-yo dieting and always, struggling with binge eating and stuff like that. So they were sort of at that point where they were willing and ready to do this. A lot of people, especially Gen Pop, who aren't in the industry and understand what maintenance calories is and don't understand the psychology around eating and aren't exposed to that kind of, I guess, dark side of dieting like she had. So she was aware that more dieting could be, detrimental. But a lot of people just aren't going to see the value in stepping away from their goal. It's like they want it now. They want that short-term gratification. They want to see the kilos come off the scale. If they're paying for it, why aren't I getting it? And that's a really hard thing, I guess, to deconstruct in people's minds, is to show them the value of stepping away from diet. Anything you want to add there, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think as coaches, that's one of the hardest conversations to have, is when, like, you don't want to come across as like, I know what's best for you more than you know what's best for you. But in some cases, if you can see this is an ongoing pattern, you can have that conversation, kind of deconstruct it and say, like, okay, well, based on your history, why would this be a goal? And I think one thing you can do as a coach is just ask questions. And in the past, I've had some success there where they kind of talk themselves out of it, just based off of honest answers. But yeah, that part's always a struggle. And I think there are times where eating at maintenance, having a larger caloric budget, it almost always is a better environment for building the habits that you want for sustainability. So if you feel like you're struggling there, then yeah, it's not a bad idea. There's no shame in doing it. And really, I think a lot of people, they want the fastest route from point A to point B, but it's oftentimes not a linear path. And so, just reminding them of that, I think, is important. But I think there's also situations where people, maybe it's like an every few month thing where they have a slip up, and overall the plan is conducive to them, and then they have a hard time getting back on track. And I think in situations like that, I try to remind them, like, regaining momentum, like just overcoming that initial inertia of getting back on track it's hard, but it's doable, and it will get easier. So I think a lot of people go from a slip up that maybe cascades into a few days or, weeks, months of, eating without structure, and they're discouraged, and it's really hard to get the ball rolling again. And just getting that ball rolling, like reminding them that they've done this in the past, I think can help, because it's once, it seems to me like a couple weeks of consistency with people, just taking it day by day, that oftentimes just rebuilds that self-efficacy that maybe they felt like they lost, and rebuilds that structure and the habits that they need to continue. But just reminding people that it gets easier once you do get back on the plan.
Yeah, that's a good point. I actually didn't think about that initially, but yeah, somebody who has been super consistent for a very long period of time, and then when they do slip up, like, that's almost more jarring than, for that person anyway, than the would be or could be to someone who's like slipping up more regularly, because they've become more accustomed to it. Like someone who hasn't experienced it for a long time, and that feeling of, I guess, fucking up and, having that loss of control, like that can be very jarring, even though if you look at, the long-term, I guess, data of, like, their consistency with their nutrition, it's like it's only one data point. It's like, well, they're killing it. You should have no issues. Like, it's only one day. Like, you've killed the past like 3 or so months. Like, what's the issue? But because it's been so long without having any issues, like that issue could be very, very disruptive to their overall psychology. And I think, that's I think very common with physique athletes, or your more serious gym bros who are like really committed to the plan. They can go 8-10 weeks, and then they have that big slip up, and then it's like, oh fuck, and then they really struggle to get back on track. And I think it's important to distinguish between those two types of slip ups. Like the more frequent slip up, they're the ones who need to focus on like learning how to get back into routine and just creating that routine. Like that's the primary objective. Whereas those people who are clearly having the routine and they've got that dialed in and then have a slip up, that requires a different approach to, I guess, navigating that. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. I think one demographic very susceptible to this is, people coming out of a contest prep. And granted, the goal has shifted, but a lot of people they go from having all of this militant structure, in the final month or two, to not having a goal that they necessarily feel good about sometimes. Like, okay, for a lot of people, it's reframing. Like, okay, the objective isn't to stay lean here. The objective is recovery, and there's some fat gain that's required for that. But you'll see people, where it's their first slip up might be, in the 48 to 72 hours post show that they frame as a slip up. And obviously there's, magnitudes here. But I think in those cases, it's like you said, it's hard for people. It's jarring when they've had all this control, and then it can kind of snowball post show, and they might gain more than they had wanted to. So, yeah,
I agree. I think the point there about like it's post show for a lot of people, it's post diet as well. And I think the primary reason that people struggle with the slip up after a diet or a successful phase of consistent eating, let's just call it that, to make it more general, is that in those situations where they're moving from one phase, like a deficit or fat loss, to say maintenance or post show, whatever it is, the goals change. So the militant structure and the consistency doesn't need to be there in the same way that did. I think, as Max said at the start of the podcast, it's like the expectations and like being able to navigate changing phases, and the expectations within those phases is what people struggle with. And that can be also the case for different situations, like the expectations around their nutrition when it comes to, say, a workday week versus when it's the weekend and they've got social events. Like, you have to have different expectations for those two different types of days, right? And I think being able to adjust your expectations with your nutrition according to the situation you're in, the phase you're in, is very important. I think a useful tool to helping you manage these slip-ups, right? What do you think of that?
Adjusting your expectations, I think, is super important, because what might usually be a piece of cake, walk in the park, whatever, for you in one scenario might be an uphill battle in another scenario. So I think having flexible expectations, being able to adjust them on the fly, is quite a useful thing. Not being a bodybuilder or anything myself, it was interesting listening to you guys talk about people who struggle with the post-show period, the post-diet, post-show period as well. That's another point I wanted to make. And I think, like, it's hard for me to know what is often the reason for that, but I think I'd be quite confident to say, you don't have that carrot dangling in front of your face anymore.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to go from being so militant in your approach, as you said, Jacob, to being like, now I should adopt a different approach that's more like life focused. And I think I can understand why so many people can struggle with that. That I think whenever you've been really disciplined at something and you've been really consistent with something, and even if you know that that's not a forever thing, moving away from that level of diligence can be quite difficult psychologically. You think, like, am I losing the, how could I say, like, eye on the prize sort of thing? Am I losing that touch, because you've built up this ability to be like really focused on something. And I think that's also a reason why a lot of people might struggle in that phase as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that, the bodybuilder, I guess, life cycle, and the season is quite short in comparison to, say, other athletic endeavors, like, say, basketball. We see the exact same thing post career, right? Like at the end of an NBA player's career, like once they've lost all that structure and commitment to that, goal, it's like, well, they struggle, they don't know what to do, and a lot of players, have mental health issues because of that. And I think the same happens with bodybuilding, but I guess the impact is more noticeable acutely, because when you move from competition phase to post show, all of a sudden you're gaining a heap of weight and you've lost your identity as an athlete, as a bodybuilder, in a very short period of time. Whereas I guess the effects of not being an NBA player anymore, like that, would sort of not be as quickly thrust upon you. Like the season ends and you sort of wake up, you're still an NBA player, you've gone through the postseason before or the off season, and it's a bit more gradual thing. But nonetheless, they still struggle with it. Whereas for people coming out of a diet, whether they're prep athletes or anyone else, and it's like if you regain a lot of weight, you're seeing that effect straight away. Like, you know, when you wake up, your cheeks are puffy, the scale goes up, your clothes aren't fitting anymore, or you're feeling shit about yourself when you've achieved all this. You're getting all these compliments from people at work, how much weight you've lost. Now you're gaining it back, and it's like that can be really, really difficult. So I think there's something to be said there, and I'm sure Brian will have some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the first step is just making it very clear that the goal has changed. Like, this is, if you're a bodybuilder post show who's, you know, obviously if you're somebody who's wanting to continue, you know, with the sport and training and, you know, training for muscularity and everything, I think there is a, like, disassociating from the previous goal and knowing, okay, this is, it's giving yourself kind of permission. You know, I know we were talking about slip ups before, but in this context, like, what you might deem a slip up at the end of prep isn't probably as big or a slip up at all post show, you know, especially in that acute recovery phase. So we want to avoid like the loss of control. But I think giving yourself that permission, like, okay, it's okay to gain weight right now. That's in my best interest as an athlete to do that, I think goes a long way with a lot of people, versus the mentality of, you know, and it's one reason, like at 3MJ, we're big advocates of like the recovery diet approach, you know, expediting that rather than, you know, what might be termed like the traditional reverse diet, where you're slowly walking calories up, you know, with the intent to stay as lean as you can. And we know objectively through the research that there's a degree of fat gain that's, you know, necessary to fully recover, and trying to stay as lean as you can and eating as much as you possibly can, like, it's not really leading us towards that goal, and it can lead us into that situation of feeling like you're failing. And when you know what the short-term goal is and what the steps are to get there, and reframing that, I think makes a huge difference.
Yeah, I like that. Mac, anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I agree with the reverse diet thing, you know, not as a bodybuilder or anything. Even just with general weight loss phases, I don't see any purpose in reverse dieting. Look, maybe a couple of scenarios when there might be benefit to you, maybe psychologically for some folks. But I think that, yeah, like, you're obviously much better off just getting back to that maintenance, because the sooner you bring calories up to maintenance, the sooner you can, I think, well, my general approach that I'm a fan of is we'll bring calories, like, let's say a client being tracking, let's just use that, bring calories to maintenance, but then it's a more gradual transition away from diet behaviors, expectations, and the whole mentality. So in that sense, like, I guess my preferred approach as a coach is somewhat reverse diet like, but not with the calories. We're not walking calories up, as you said there, Brian.
Can I just
Yeah,
add
so
to
definitely
that
agree.
quickly? Can I add to that quickly, Mac? What I like to do with the reverse dieting is, instead of doing it after the diet, which is its typical application, I do it during the fat loss phase. So when the client's lost that initial amount of weight, say the rate of loss is around 1.5% of body weight per week, and we've got most of the fat off that we want to, and then maybe the final, you know, 2 to 6 weeks, depending on how long the diet's been, then I start to bring calories up to make the deficit smaller, teaching them how to eat more food without necessarily compromising their body composition, and actually having benefits to their body composition, you know, with glycogen storage, you know, some weird things related to stress, water retention, all this kind of stuff, and actually walk their calories up so that the hunger decreases, or depending on how much weight they've lost, how long they've been dieting. Like, this is, I'm talking for a Gen Pop client, for example, who won't necessarily experience hunger in the same way a prep athlete would. Bring their calories up slowly, so they're not afraid of more food. It doesn't have any negative body composition effects in the short term. Teach them that eating more food is the goal, and it's okay, and it's part of the fat loss phase. They're still seeing the number on the scale go down, you know, slowly but less frequently. You just start to take away some of the diet fatigue, and to prepare them, you put them in a better position for the post-diet phase, right? I think that can really mitigate a lot of the dire situations that people experience with post diet blowout if they're eating more food for a few weeks at least beforehand, and including things like diet breaks and refeeds along the way. To obviously teach that skill that eating more food is not necessarily a bad thing. And seeing the scale go up isn't necessarily a bad thing. And it really does teach people to manage their expectations around food and their scale weight, and get a little bit more comfortable with those types of situations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. In my view, you're kind of like, you're showing the benefits of eating a little bit more. And because it's still in the dieting phase, I guess it would also help someone realize that, that can be a helpful thing, or, eating more calories can be done in a conscious way or done in a controlled way. And you kind of like, maybe you could even view it as like practicing for when the diet is actually over. And obviously, in your context, the folks that you guys work with, bodybuilders, like the eating what you're describing there to me is like eating into the show, which is something I've heard before. And it also makes a lot of sense if you've got a lot of diet induced stress on the body, fatigue, those sort of things. And obviously there's the glycogen components and all that bodybuilding stuff that, well, it's not just bodybuilding, in athletes in competitive sports and what have you. Yeah, and that's actually a good point. Like, I do that with athletes in competitive, like physical sports, not bodybuilding, but whether they're a weightlifter, mountain biker, whatever it might be. It's actually something that I've often done that I didn't think of in that way. I've kind of reverse dieted them in a sense. So you've kind of contradicted me there. You caught me out there, Jacob. Well played.
I didn't mean to catch you out. I wasn't trying to do that. Brian, anything you want to add there?
No, I think, yeah, when you first said that, I thought to myself, like, it's similar on paper with the idea of like ending your diet, then reverse dieting, because you're still going to be in a deficit as you gradually reverse diet after a diet, but knowing that it's part of the diet.
It's within the original time frame of the planned diet, not okay. We're doing a 10-week diet and then we're going to reverse. It's like your reverse diet is within this original 10 weeks. Yeah.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. And I think that's huge. I think is people say like, okay, this is part of my plan now to finish out this diet. And then once you're done with the deficit, it's like you're already eating at maintenance. It's not like, okay, the deficit is over, now I'm turned loose. And let's see if I can control it. It's a structured part, which I definitely think psychologically that has a lot of value. And I think
almost like an exit strategy, right? And I think that's what helps people, is like having a strategy that walks them slowly, because the body likes to be coaxed along. And I think anything that is really disruptive or too large of a disturbance to physiology, whether it's dropping calories right down, hunger goes right up. Increasing activity, drastically, well, your, non-exercise activity thermogenesis is going to plummet, right? And I think the same can be said for, psychological stuff related to nutrition. Like when we go from a deficit and all this structure and this goal, like Max said, with the carrot dangling in front, to all of a sudden, okay, we can have more flexibility now, like, post show. Okay, well, yeah, here's your calories, but you don't really have to follow them anymore because there's no deadlines.
right.
I think that really, immediate transition psychologically from, okay, well, I've got this goal, now I've got this goal, holy shit, that requires completely different things. That's what fucks people up. I think that is why most people struggle with their nutrition coming out of a diet, is because it's just that large overhaul in like their psychology, their goal, like what their expectations are, what their behaviors should look like, the amount of rigidity or flexibility, all these kind of things. I think if you can transition people more slowly and I guess make that less of a obvious and distinct change, people can deal with it a little bit better. They're not like as messed up. And I think like that's definitely something I've played around with over the years, and it seems to work for most people. And obviously, it like doesn't always work. Like there are some people who are just like, when they know the fat loss phase is over, they're still going to just fucking blow out anyway, right? For a lot of people, it has improved, I guess, the overall severity of that post diet, blowout, and like how people manage that. And I guess their overall feelings post diet as well. Like they're not as out of control as what I think my clients used to be, when I would just go, cool, we're finished the diet, go to maintenance or do whatever you want now.
Yeah. And I think, contest prep it's a little bit of a different situation because people
there's no plan that's going to work post show. Like, I don't give a shit what anyone says. Like, you just got to write it out. You got to run.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the big takeaway with athletes post show is like it's not going to be perfect. The success rate of traditional reverse dieting post show is
I would like to know your success rates post show with like recovery diet, reverse diet, whatever. Obviously, like some athletes can absolutely do it, but like if you all the competitors that you've worked with, like what would you say percentage wise the success?
I am yet to. I mean, I haven't really done a reverse diet post show for somebody in probably like 7, 8 years. But the success rate was abysmal. Like it was, they would do it for a while, but it's like in order to do it, I think a lot of people sacrifice all the other elements of freedom that they should have post show. It's like if you are reverse dieting and you're living by yourself and you're a recluse, like it's going to be a lot easier and more practical then, but it's probably not the right thing to be doing, because there's especially with a show, I mean, there's sacrifices other people make. You want to loosen up, gain some flexibility for other people as well. So yeah, I think the recovery diet though, I mean, there's kind of the people that think, okay, now the goal is to gain like very rapidly, and it's certainly a more assertive rate of gain, but I think psychologically people don't beat themselves up as much. And I honestly think for the majority of people, they end up sort of in the same place if I were to assign somebody a more traditional reverse diet, they're probably going to gain pretty assertively anyway, because they don't have that carrot in front of them, like you said, and it's going to be harder to stick to it. But if I just say, okay, this is the acceptable amount, or this is the target amount that we're aiming to gain, and there's usually a range there too. It's not like, okay, you need to gain 8 pounds, and any more than that's suboptimal. We give them a range, and at that point, like it's giving them there's just not as much guilt associated with it. But like you said, it's just needing to ride it out. And, even recovery diets, like it's not easy, especially, if you're a first time competitor, but it does get post show period gets easier with each season, I think, for most people. But the people I think that do the best are the ones who understand, like, okay, I competed, now this is what I need to do to get better. This is the next step. And this is what's required in order to recover. And part of that is a surplus in being okay with weight coming up.
I like that. And I think that's a good place to wrap things up. The key takeaway there is like a surplus isn't your friend. And if you're constantly finding yourself in a surplus, without planning it or having that as part of your goal, then maybe you actually need to spend time in a surplus to sort some shit out. But that was really good. Guys, thank you very much for joining us today. Brian, where can people find you?
The Team 3D Muscle Journey, 3dmusclejourney.com. And then I'm on Instagram at BD Minor.
And MyoJournal. Don't forget to send people to that website.
MyoJournal, yeah. MyoJournal is under construction at the moment. It's still up, but there's some tweaks being done.
A lot of really good articles there. Brian, thank you. Mackenzie, thank you. And guys, we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, guys.
All right.